The room is quiet, in the way only hearing rooms get quiet when everyone knows microphones are live and history is being typed in real time. Papers rest flat, staffers stop whispering, cameras hold steady. Nothing dramatic has happened yet, but the air has shifted into attention. At the center of the dais, the chairman looks down at the list in front of him and speaks in a measured procedural tone. He calls on the next senator. There is no emphasis, no change in pace, just a name spoken as part of the routine order of questioning. Senator Hawley. Across the table, Kash Patel sits upright as the nominee, hands together, posture controlled. He has already answered questions from several senators. The rhythm has been predictable. Introductions, policy statements, familiar concerns. The exchange so far has felt structured, almost rehearsed in its civility. But this call feels different, even before a single word is spoken. Hawley leans toward his microphone without rushing. There is no stack of papers waved in the air, no visible attempt to create a spectacle. The movement is calm, deliberate, almost understated, the kind of movement that signals preparation rather than performance. The room does not react, but it seems to settle. This is still the same hearing, same nominee, same process, yet the atmosphere tightens slightly, as if the next line of questioning is about to step outside the pattern everyone has grown comfortable with. Nothing has been said yet to explain why. And that is precisely what makes the moment matter. What followed did not sound like the earlier exchanges that morning. There was no broad discussion of policy priorities or familiar references to crime statistics and staffing levels. Instead, the tone shifted into something narrower, more precise, as if the questions were anchored to a document already sitting in the public record. Hawley did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He asked whether Patel was familiar with a particular FBI memorandum that had circulated within the Bureau. The wording was careful, specific, and tied to something that already existed beyond the room. Patel indicated that he was familiar with it. The focus of the questions was not theoretical. Hawley described the subject of the memo in direct terms, asking whether it would be appropriate for the FBI to seek informants within religious institutions, specifically Catholic parishes. The framing was not rhetorical, it was procedural, almost clinical, as if the goal was simply to establish whether such an approach aligned with Patel's view of how the Bureau should operate. Patel responded plainly that he did not believe it would be appropriate. There was no argument, no interruption. Just a sequence of questions that felt less like debate and more like clarification of a record that already existed. Hawley's delivery remained even, but the specificity of the topic gave the exchange a weight that had been absent from earlier conversations. The hearing had not become louder, it had become more focused, and it was becoming clear that Hawley's questions were not meant to explore policy in the abstract, but to define a position on something concrete, something documented, something that would remain on the official transcript long after the hearing ended. In this portion of the exchange, the questions stopped being about awareness and started becoming about commitments. Hawley shifted from asking whether Patel knew about the memorandum to asking what he would do about it. The tone remained controlled, but the direction narrowed into action. Rather than debating intent, Hawley asked if Patel would commit to withdrawing the memo if he became director. Patel answered carefully, adding a condition that would be repeated several times. If confirmed, yes. That phrasing mattered. It placed the promise into the official future, linking his authority to a specific action. Hawley continued without pause. He asked whether Patel would look into how the document was created, who approved it, and how it circulated inside the Bureau. Again, Patel did not resist. He gave the same conditional assurance. The pattern was forming. Identify a documented issue, ask for a direct commitment, receive an answer tied to confirmation. Hawley then moved to another matter already present in public discussion, reports involving parents at school board meetings. He referenced whistleblower claims and asked whether Patel would investigate those activities internally and ensure they would not continue. The structure of the questioning did not change. Patel replied, if confirmed, absolutely. The word added emphasis without raising volume. Another commitment entered the record. Hawley pressed further, turning to concerns about religious targeting in cases involving pro-life individuals. He asked whether Patel would guarantee that such targeting would end under his leadership. Patel replied that there would be no such targeting, again linking the assurance to his confirmation.
By this point, the exchange had become a sequence of on-record pledges. Each answer stood alone, but together they created weight. The discussion was no longer about whether these issues were controversial. It was about what Patel said he would do once empowered to act. Hawley did not editorialize. He did not summarize. He simply moved from topic to topic, placing each concern beside a clear verbal commitment. The hearing room remained quiet, but the transcript was becoming dense with promises. No one interrupted. No one objected. The pace stayed measured, allowing every answer to settle into the record. What made the sequence unusual was not the intensity of the tone, but the accumulation of responsibility. By the end, several distinct issues had been tied directly to Patel's future authority. They were no longer abstract concerns. They were commitments waiting for a confirmation vote. And each one now existed permanently in the Senate record, attached to Patel's own words. The exchange had built pressure without raising its voice.
It relied on repetition, precision, and the steady rhythm of conditional agreement. By the time Hawley finished, the hearing had quietly transformed into a ledger of expectations. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet the weight of what was said could be felt in the stillness of the room. The moment did not end with confrontation. It ended with documentation. The questions had drawn lines that would not disappear once the hearing adjourned. They would remain preserved in text, waiting for the day those promises could be measured against reality. That is what gave it weight. Months passed between that hearing and the next time the two men faced each other across the same committee room. The setting looked familiar, but the roles had changed. Patel was no longer a nominee answering hypotheticals. He was now seated as director, carrying the authority that had once been conditional. The earlier exchange did not need to be mentioned to exist. It remained preserved in the record, attached to his own words. The oversight hearing unfolded with the same procedural calm as before. Senators took turns, questions rotated, and the rhythm felt orderly. Yet the context was different. Every response now came from someone who had already outlined how he intended to handle specific issues inside the Bureau. Those commitments, once tied to confirmation, had quietly followed him into office. When Hawley's turn arrived again, the tone remained measured. There was no need to recreate the earlier discussion. The groundwork had already been laid months earlier in the transcript. Instead, the exchange carried an unspoken continuity. The room did not need to be reminded of what had been said before. It was understood that those words still existed unchanged in the Senate record. Coverage of the hearing described it as tense but controlled. Questions were direct, answers were careful. Nothing about the setting suggested spectacle. Yet there was a noticeable deliberateness in how each response was phrased, as if the presence of past commitments made every word carry additional weight. The moment did not escalate, it slowed, and in that slower pace, the connection between the past hearing and this one became quietly visible. The exchange did not rise in volume, it narrowed. Questions were asked in the same calm tone as before, but the space between words seemed to widen. Patel answered carefully, choosing phrasing that avoided unnecessary extension. Each response arrived measured, as if being placed deliberately rather than spoken freely. There were no interruptions, no sharp retorts. The hearing room remained orderly, almost subdued. Yet the pace felt different from earlier portions of the session. Where other senators had moved quickly through topics, this sequence unfolded more slowly, with pauses that allowed each answer to settle before the next question began.
Hawley did not need to restate the earlier commitments. They existed without being repeated. Instead, the questions seemed to hover near them, drawing attention through proximity rather than direct reference. Patel's replies stayed precise, neither expanding beyond what was asked nor retreating into generalities. The carefulness itself became noticeable. Nothing dramatic occurred on the surface. There was no visible disagreement, no raised voices, no declarative moment that could be clipped into a headline. What stood out was the restraint. The sense that both participants understood the weight of prior statements and adjusted their delivery accordingly. The silence between exchanges began to feel meaningful, not empty, but occupied by what had already been said months earlier. The hearing did not need an explosive moment to create tension. It created it through pacing, through caution, through the deliberate avoidance of excess words. Viewers watching closely would sense that something important was happening without being able to point to a single dramatic line. The tension came from what was not being elaborated on, from how tightly the conversation stayed within boundaries. The earlier record lingered just beneath the surface, shaping the present exchange without being named. By the end of the sequence, the room felt unchanged, yet subtly heavier. Nothing new had been revealed, but the careful rhythm of question and answer had turned the absence of confrontation into its own form of evidence. The restraint itself carried the message, leaving an impression that extended beyond the words spoken aloud. What remained after the exchange was not a headline or a single defining quote. It was the accumulation of statements that already existed in the official record. The earlier hearing had placed a series of commitments into writing, each tied to future authority. The oversight session did not erase those words or replace them. It simply occurred in their shadow. Nothing in the room announced that connection directly. There was no summary offered, no reminder spoken aloud. Yet the continuity between the two moments could be felt by anyone aware of what had been said months earlier. The weight came from knowing that the promises had not disappeared when the hearing ended. They had followed Patel into his role, preserved line by line in the Senate transcript. The significance of the moment was not found in confrontation, but in preservation. The record does not fade with time. It waits quietly, holding language exactly as it was spoken. Every assurance, every conditional commitment, every careful phrase remained available for anyone willing to read it. That is what gave the exchange its gravity, not what was added, but what already existed. The hearing did not resolve those earlier statements. It did not need to. Their presence alone shaped how the conversation unfolded and how the answers were delivered. In the end, the story was not about what happened in the room that day. It was about what had been written before and could still be read after.